Continuing Sylla from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. After this, hearing that Flaccus, a man of the contrary faction, had been chosen consul, and was crossing the Ionian Sea with an army professedly tacked against Mithridates, but in reality against himself, he hastened towards Thessaly, designing to meet him, but in his march, when near Melita, received advices from all parts that the country behind him were overrun and ravaged by no less a royal army than the former. For Dorolaus, arriving at Chalcis with a large fleet, on board of which he brought over with him 80,000 of the best appointed, best disciplined soldiers of Mithridates' army, at once invaded Boeotia and occupied the country in hopes to bring Sylla to a battle, making no account of the dissuasions of Archelaus, but giving it out as to the last fight that without treachery so many thousand men could never have perished. Sylla, however, facing about expeditiously, made it clear to him that Archelaus was a wise man and had good skill in the Roman valor, insomuch that he himself, after some small skirmishes with Sylla near Tilphasium, was the first of those who thought it not advisable to put things to the decision of the sword, but rather to wear out the war by expense of time and treasure. The ground, however, near Orchomenus, where they lay encamped, gave some encouragement to Archelaus, being a battlefield admirably suited for an army superior in cavalry. Of all the plains in Boeotia, they are renowned for their beauty and extent. This alone, which commences from the city of Orchomenus, spreads out, unbroken and clear of trees, to the edge of the fens, in which the Melas, rising close under Orchomenus, loses itself, the only Greek river which is a deep and navigable water from the very head, increasing also about the summer solstice like the Nile, and producing plants similar to those that grow there, only small and without fruit. It does not run far before the main stream disappears among the blind and woody marsh grounds. A small branch, however, joins Cephissus about the place where the lake is thought to produce the best fruit reeds. Now that both armies were posted near each other, Archelaus lay still, but Sylla employed himself in cutting ditches from either side, that if possible, by driving the enemies from the firm and open champaign, he might force them into the fens. They, on the other hand, not enduring this, as soon as their leaders allowed them the word of command, issued out furiously in large bodies, when not only the men at work were dispersed, but most of those who stood in arms to protect the work fled in disorder. Upon this, Sylla leapt from his horse, and, snatching hold of an ensign, rushed through the midst of the rout upon the enemy, crying out aloud, "To me, O Romans, it will be glorious to fall here. As for you, when they ask you where you betrayed your general, remember to say at Orchomenus," his men rallying again at these words, and two cohorts coming to his succor from the right wing, he led them to the charge, and turned the day. Then retiring some short distance and refreshing his men, he proceeded again with his works to block up the enemy's camp. They again sallied out in better order than before. Here Diogenes, stepson to Archelaus, fighting on the right wing with much gallantry, made an honorable end, and the archers, being hard pressed by the Romans and wanting space for a retreat, took their arrows by handfuls, and striking with these as with swords, beat them back. In the end, however, they were all driven into the entrenchment, and had a sorrowful night of it, with their slain and wounded. The next day again, Sylla, leading forth his men up to their quarters, went on finishing the lines of entrenchment, when they issued out again with larger numbers to give them battle, fell on them and put them to the rout, and in the consternation ensuing, none daring to abide, he took the camp by storm. The marshes were filled with blood, and the lake with dead bodies, insomuch that to this day many bows, helmets, fragments of iron, breastplates, and swords of barbarian make continue to be found buried deep in mud 200 years after the fight. Thus, much of the action in Chaeronea and Orchomenus at Rome, Cina and Carbo were now using injustice and violence towards persons of the greatest eminence, and many of them, to avoid this tyranny, repaired as to a safe harbor to Sylla's camp, where in a short space he had about him the aspect of a senate. Metella likewise, having with difficulty conveyed herself and children away by stealth, brought him word that his houses, both in town and country, had been burnt by his enemies, and entreated his help at home, whilst he was in doubt what to do, being impatient to hear of his country being thus outraged, and yet not knowing how to leave so great a work as the Mithridatic War unfinished. There comes to him Archelaus, a merchant of Delos, with hopes of an accommodation and private instructions from Archelaus, the king's general. Sylla liked the business so well as to desire a speedy conference with Archelaus in person, and a meeting took place on the seacoast near Delium, where the temple of Apollo stands. When Archelaus opened the conversation and began to urge Sylla to abandon his pretensions to Asia, not the same as the continent of Asia, but over by Turkey is where at one point it was considered that Asia was here, Africa was there, and Pontus, and to set sail for the war in Rome, receiving money and shipping, and such forces as he should think fitting from the king. Sylla interposing, bid Archelaus take no further care for Mithridates, but assume the crown to himself and become a competitor of Rome, delivering up the navy. I'll show you right quick here. I guess we can't really see too well, but there was the idea, for example, that's actually a bit older, that this side is Europe, Africa is here, and Asia would be on the other side of the Himalayas. So the four tribes, the Hindus 4 tribes, and Persians 4 tribes. So that tribe, and the Slavic people would be one race, and then the Mongolians and whatnot. But Asia, yeah, right about over there. Just Turkey and Archelaus, professing his abhorrence of such treason, Sylla proceeded. So you, Archelaus, a Cappadocian and slave, are, if it so please you, friend, to a barbarian king, would not, upon such vast considerations, be guilty of what is dishonorable. and yet dare to talk to me, Roman general and Sylla, of treason? And if you were not the self-same Archelaus who ran away at Chaeronea, with a few remaining out of 120,000 men, who lay for 2 days in the fens of Orchomenus, and left Boeotia impassable for heaps of dead carcasses, Archelaus, changing his tone at this, humbly besought him to lay aside the thoughts of war and make peace with Mithridates. Sylla, consenting to this request, articles of agreement were concluded on that Mithridates should quit Asia and Paphlagonia. And, of course, it's basically around the Mediterranean. And one of the things that they had, some of the Greek origin myths, per se, actually trace things clear over to, the Oxus or over by Afghanistan and stuff. But, really, Turkey is sort of the border. Well, it wasn't called Turkey at that time, but you know what I mean? It's sort of the border of the region we're talking about, and the others, of course, the Pillars of Hercules on the other side of the Mediterranean. To restore Bithynia to Nicomedes, Cappadocia to Ariobarzanes, and to pay the Romans 2,000 talents. A talent is like a person's weight of metal, and give him 70 ships of war with all their furniture. On the other hand, that Sylla should confirm to him his other dominions and declare him a Roman confederate. On these terms he proceeded by the way of Thessaly and Macedon towards the Hellespont, having Archelaus with him, and treating him with great attention, for Archelaus being taken dangerously ill at Larissa, he stopped the march of the army, and took care of him as if he had been one of his own captains, or his colleague in command. This gave suspicion of foul play in the battle of Chaeronea, as it was also observed that Sylla had released all the friends of Mithridates, taken prisoners in war, except only Aristion the tyrant, who was at enmity with Archelaus, and was put to death by poison. And above all, 10,000 acres of land in Euboea had been given to the Cappadocian, and had received from Sylla the style of a friend and ally of the Romans, on which points Sylla defends himself in his memoirs. The ambassadors of Mithridates arriving and declaring that they accepted of the conditions only Paphlagonia they could not part with. And as for the ships professing not to know of any such capitulation, Sylla in a rage exclaimed, "What say you? Does Mithridates then withhold Paphlagonia? And as to the ships, deny that article. I thought to have seen him prostrate at my feet, to thank me for leaving him so much as that right hand of his, which has cut off so many Romans. He will shortly, at my coming over into Asia, speak another language. In the meantime, let him at his ease in Pergamus sit, managing a war which he never saw." The ambassadors in terror stood silent by, but Archelaus endeavored with humble supplications to assuage his wrath, laying hold on his right hand and weeping. In conclusion, he obtained permission to go himself in person to Mithridates, for that he would either mediate a peace to the satisfaction of Sylla, or if not, slay himself. Sylla having thus dispatched him away, and made an inroad into Madica, after wide depopulations, returned back again into Macedon, where he received Archelaus about Philippi, bringing word that all was well, and that Mithridates earnestly requested an interview. The chief cause of the meeting was Fimbria, for he, having assassinated Flaccus, the consul of contrary faction, and worsted the Mithridatic commanders, was advancing against Mithridates himself, who, fearing this, chose rather to seek the friendship of Sylla. And one of the things that if people think, oh, you're going to hurt yourself or you might kill yourself or something, there's people who will do things specifically, or not do things specifically, because they're going to think it's going to make it more likely, or at least cause the distress that they want you to hurt yourself too, so don't fall for that stuff, whether it's the impulse or suggestions from others, right? And so met at Dardanus in the Trod. On one side, Mithridates attended with 200 ships. It could be a Mithridates or something. I don't know. I can't. There's not Greek characters or something. But anyways, attended with 200 ships and land forces, consisting of 20,000 men at arms, 6,000 horse, and a large train of scythed chariots. On the other, Sylla, with only 4 cohorts and 200 horse, as Mithridates drew near and put out his hand, Sylla demanded whether he was willing or no to end the war on the terms Archelaus had agreed to, but seeing the king made no answer, how was this? He continued. Ought not the petitioner to speak first, and the conqueror to listen in silence? And when Mithridates, entering upon his plea, began to shift off the war, partly on what they considered to be gods, and partly to blame the Romans themselves. Well, whether God or whether some other entities that are being worshipped, don't they give opportunities? What people do with them is, their fault. He took him up, saying that he had heard, indeed, long since from others, and now he knew it himself for truth, that Mithridates was a powerful speaker, who, in defense of the most foul and unjust proceedings, had not wanted for specious pretenses. Then charging him with and inveighing bitterly against the outrages he had committed, he had again whether he was willing or no to ratify the treaty of Archelaus. Mithridates answering in the affirmative, Sylla came forward, embraced and kissed him. Not long after he induced Ariobarzanes and Nicomedes, the 2 kings, and made them friends. Mithridates, when he had handed over to Sylla 70 ships and 500 archers, set sail for Pontus. Sylla, perceiving these soldiers to be dissatisfied with the peace, as it seemed indeed a monstrous thing that they should see the king who was their bitterest enemy and who had caused 150,000 Romans to be massacred in one day in Asia, now sailing off with the riches and spoils of Asia, which he had pillaged, and put under contribution for the space of 4 years, in his defense to them alleged that he could not have made head against Fimbria and Mithridates, had they both withstood him in conjunction. Thence he set out and went in search of Fimbria, who lay with the army about Thyatira, and pitching his camp not far off, proceeded to fortify Thyatira with a trench. The soldiers of Fimbria came out in their single coats, and saluting his men, lent ready assistance to the work, which change Fimbria, beholding and apprehending Sylla as irreconcilable, laid violent hands on himself in the camp. Sylla imposed on Asia in general a tax of 20,000 talents, and despoiled individually each family by the licentious behavior and long residence of the soldiery in private quarters, for he ordered that every host should allow his guest 4 tetradrachms each day, and moreover entertain him and as many friends as he should invite with a supper, that a centurion should receive 50 drachmas a day, together with one suit of clothes to wear within doors, and another when he went abroad. Having set out from Ephesus with the whole army, he came the third day to anchor in the Piraeus. Here he was initiated into the mysteries, and seized for his use the library of Apellicon the Teian, in which were most of the works of Theophrastus and Aristotle, then not in general circulation. Well, nowadays the mysteries, you could say, are for all, but that's why the Persians are all weird. They call them magus because it's like, oh, these people can do their own rituals, and they're a nation of priests and priestesses. Of course, that's what Muhammad and Jesus and other ones kind of really put forward. Although, you with each of those and more, you definitely have this conservative path where, you can't get married without some priest. You can't have a weekly service without, without a separate priest class, and you have to pay them a chunk of your salary and all that sort of stuff, rather than them volunteering to lead rituals. Teaching and doing their media thing, fine, let them get paid for that. But rituals and selling religion, yeah, no. When the whole was afterwards conveyed to Rome, there, it is said, the greater part of the collection passed through the hands of Turanian the grammarian, and that Andronicus the Rhodian, having through this means the commands of numerous copies, made the treatises public, and drew up the catalogues that are now current. The elder Peripatetics appear themselves indeed to have been accomplished and learned men, but of the writings of Aristotle and Theophrastus they had no large or exact knowledge, because Theophrastus, bequeathing his books to the heir of Neleus of Skepsis, they came into careless and illiterate hands. During Sylla's stay about Athens, his feet were attacked by a heavy, benumbing pain, which Strabo calls the first inarticulate sounds of the gout. Taking therefore a voyage to Adepsus, he made use of the hot waters there, allowing himself at the same time to forget all anxieties and passing away his time with actors. As he was walking along the seashore, certain fishermen brought him some magnificent fish. Being much delighted with the gift, and understanding on inquiry that they were men of Hala'a. Can't think of any other name or word that has what, said he, are there any men of Hala'a surviving? For after his victory at Orchomenus, in the heat of a pursuit that had destroyed 3 cities of Boeotia, well, names in African languages, but Anthedon, Larumna, and Hala'a, the men not knowing what to say for fear, Sylla, with a smile, bade them cheer up and return in peace, as they had brought with them no insignificant intercessors. The Halaans say that this first gave them courage to reunite and return to their city. Now, of course, the better approach, now, certainly you want to let yourself heal and all that sort of stuff, but the better approach psychologically is not to escape, not to bring in, per se, comfort to distract you, or that sort of thing. Sure, seek comfort and good and all that sort of stuff, but to actually work through the anxieties in a way that you you know, you're finding that comfort, even though there are difficulties or whatnot. But yeah, don't let yourself be crippled or whatever because you're not dealing with something. Now I don't really know how to deal. I don't know offhand how to deal with gout, and I'm not making medical claims here or anything. I'm just, because yeah, you do need to get off your feet sometimes to let yourself heal and get better of contagious things too. Sylla, having marched through Thessaly and Macedon to the seacoast, prepared with 1,200 vessels to cross over from Dyrrhachium to Brundisium. Now you got to be careful of the, those filter organs, right? And a bunch of preservatives and all that sort of stuff, because yeah, those can settle places. Not far from hence is Apollonia, and near it the Nymphaeum, a spot of ground where from among green trees and meadows there are found at various points springs of fire continually streaming out. Here they say a satire, such as statuaries and painters represent, was caught asleep and brought before Sylla, where he was asked by several interpreters who he was, after much trouble, at last uttered nothing intelligible, but a harsh noise, something between the neighing of a horse and crying of a goat. Sylla, in dismay and deprecating such an omen, bade it be removed. At the point of transportation, Sylla being in alarm, lest at their first setting foot upon Italy the soldiers should disband and disperse, one by one, among the cities, they of their own accord first took an oath to stand firm by him, and not of their goodwill to injure Italy, and then seeing him in distress for money, they made, so they say, a free will offering, and contributed each man according to his ability. However, Sylla would not accept of their offering, but praising their goodwill and arousing up their courage, went over, as he himself writes, against 15 hostile generals in command of 450 cohorts, but not without the most unmistakable divine intimations of his approaching happy successes. For when he was sacrificing at his first landing near Tarentum, the victim's liver showed the figure of a crown of laurel with two fillets hanging from it. And a little while before his arrival at Campania, near the mountain Hephaestus, two stately goats were seen in the daytime, fighting together and performing all the motions of men in battle. It proved to be an apparition, arising up gradually from the ground, dispersed in the air like fancied representations in the clouds, and so vanquished out of sight. Not long after, in the selfsame place, when Marius the Younger and Norbanus the Consul attacked him with two great armies, without prescribing the order of battle, and arranging his men according to their divisions, by the sway only of one common alacrity and transport of courage, he overthrew the enemy and shut up Norbanus into the city of Capua, with the loss of 700 with the loss of 7,000 of his men. And this was the reason, he says, that soldiers did not leave him and disperse into the different towns, but held fast to him, and despised the enemy through infinitely more in number. Oh, though infinitely more in number. Well, of course, that is an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Well, what he means. At Sylvium, as he himself relates it, there met him a servant of Pontius in a state of divine possession, saying that he brought him the power of the sword and victory from Bellona, the female entity of war, and if he did not make haste, that the capital would be burnt, which fell out on the same day the man foretold it, namely, on the 6th day of the month Quintilis, which we now call July. At Fidentia also, Marcus Lucullus is one of Sylla's commanders, reposed such confidence in the forwardness of the soldiers as to dare to face 50 cohorts of the enemy, with only 16 of his own, but because many of them were unarmed, delayed the onset, as he stood thus waiting, and, considering with himself, a gentle gale of wind, bearing along with it from the neighboring meadows a quantity of flowers, scattered them down upon the army, on whose shields and helmets they settled, and arranged themselves spontaneously so as to give the soldiers in the eyes of the enemy the appearance of being crowned with chaplets. Upon this, being yet further animated, they joined battle, and victoriously slaying 8,000 men, took the camp. Thus Lucullus was brother to that Lucullus who in after times conquered Mithridates and Tyrannus. Now, wasn't it? But, did they start things? They were talking about the moon, the new moon, and the new moon or the full moon in March. Oh, I don't want to call it, but possibly it doesn't exactly line up with our July, as we say, except part of it like July 20th or whatever. Because then you'd have, that starts a 5th month, with 1 month starting around the equinox of spring. Sylla, seeing himself still surrounded by so many armies and such mighty hostile powers, had recourse to art, inviting Scipio, the other consul, to a treaty of peace. The motion was willingly embraced, and several meetings and consultations ensued, in all which Sylla, still interposing matter of delay and new pretenses, in the meanwhile debauched Scipio's men by means of his own, who were as well practiced as the general himself in all the artifices of inveigling. For, entering into the enemy's quarters and joining in conversation, they gained some by present money, some by promises, others by fair words and persuasions, so that in the end, when Sylla, with 20 cohorts, drew near on his men, saluting Scipio's soldiers, they returned the greeting and came over, leaving Scipio behind them in his tent, where he was found all alone and dismissed, and having used his 20 cohorts as decoys to ensnare the 40 of the enemy, he led them all back into the camp. On this occasion, Carbo was heard to say that he had both a fox and a lion in the breast of Sylla to deal with, and was most troubled with the fox. Some time after, at Signia, Marius the Younger, with 85 cohorts, offered battle to Sylla, who was extremely desirous to have it decided on that very day. For the night before, he had seen a vision in his sleep of Marius the Elder, who had been some time dead, advising his son to beware of the following day, as a fatal consequence to him. For this reason, Sylla, longing to come to a battle, set off for the Libella, who lay encamped at some distance. But because the enemy had beset and blocked up the passes, his soldiers got tired with skirmishing and marching at once. Try not to wait for a sign, but to have the principles and whatnot. Regardless, it's like when people with tarot cards, it's like, well, the tarot card doesn't give us favorably, but you're answer yourself through this stuff. Arrange your thoughts, but don't say, well, I can't make my decision unless the cards say. No, you're saying the cards are, you're arranging whatever meaning that you want with it. Same thing with the people who lead these who do oracle reading for others. To these difficulties was added, moreover, tempestuous rainy weather, which distressed them most of all. The principal officers therefore came. The soldiers lay stretched on the ground where they had thrown themselves down in their weariness, resting their heads upon their shields to gain some repose, when, with much reluctance, he had yielded and given orders for pitching the camp. They had no sooner begun to cast up the rampart and draw the ditch, but Marius came riding up furiously at the head of his troops in hopes to scatter them in that disorder and confusion. Because we're further on away from that, but oh, that reminds me of something. That's the same thing. That's what what cards and throwing, the calorie shells and all that. Here the entities fulfilled Sylla's dream, for the soldiers stirred up with an anger that left off their work, and sticking their javelins into the bank, with drawn swords and a courageous shout, came to blows with the enemy, who made but small resistance and lost great numbers in the flight. Marius fled to Praeneste, but, finding the gates shut, tied himself round by a rope that was thrown down to him, and was taken up on the wall. Some there are, as Venestella for one, who affirm that Marius knew nothing of the fight, but overwatched and spent with hard duty, had reposed himself when the signal was given beneath some shade, and was hardly to be awakened at the flight of his men. Sylla, according to his own account, lost only 23 men in this fight, having killed of the enemy 20,000 and taken alive 8,000. The like success attended his lieutenants Pompey, Crassus, Metellus, Servilius, who, with little or no loss, cut off vast numbers of the enemy, insomuch that Carbo, the prime supporter of the cause, fled by night from his charge of the army and sailed over into Libaa. In the last struggle, however, the Samnite Telesinus, like some champion whose lot it is to enter last of all into the lists and take up the wearied conqueror, came nigh to have foiled and overthrown Sylla before the gates of Rome. For Telesinus, with his second, Lamponius, the Laconian, having collected a large force, had been hastening towards Praeneste to relieve Marius from the siege, but perceiving Sylla ahead of him and Pompey behind, both hurrying up against him, straightened thus before him and marching and behind as valiant and experienced soldier. He rose by night, and marching directly with his whole army, was within a little of making his way unexpectedly into Rome itself.